Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspectives and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges from it. In this episode, we'll be dealing with the ongoing war in Ukraine that has now entered its fourth month. It has turned out to be the biggest land battle in Europe since the Second World War. There are two major developments that have happened recently that would decide on the longevity of the war. The first is the fall of Mariupol to Russian forces. Mariupol is the most important eastern port of Ukraine and oversees both the Azov Sea and to some extent the Black Sea. The other is the development of Finland and Sweden wanting to join NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and they're overturning decades of neutrality to do that. Both these developments, very, very important developments, have a bearing on the key question that we will answer: how long will the war last? Let's begin with the fall of Mariupol to Russian forces. Mariupol might be geographically a small area, but it is a key port to the Azov Sea, and with it going into Russian hands, Russia now controls 80% of Ukraine's Black Sea coastline. Before the war, Mariupol was used as a port for Ukraine to do its major exports. That included coal, it included grain, and it included steel, among other products. Combined with the Russian naval blockade of Odessa, the other key Ukrainian port to the Black Sea, Russia has been able to end Ukraine's once flourishing maritime trade and, apart from that, isolate the country from the rest of the world. The fall of Mariupol to Russia could be the turning point in the ongoing war. To understand the implications of that, we need to backpedal a bit and go into why Putin decided to invade Ukraine. By the way, Putin doesn't call it an invasion. The Russians say this is a special operation. But whatever the euphemism that is used, it is clear that at that moment, Putin said that Russia's security was threatened and its very existence was in danger. To understand Putin's dilemma, I would like to take an analogy with Homer's epic, the Odyssey, in which he narrates the story of the legendary Greek king, Ulysses, navigating the waters of the Mediterranean Sea close to Italy. And at an isthmus, there are two fierce sea monsters, one called Scylla and the other called Charybdis. Now, Charybdis is the more fearsome monster. So he had to take a call where if he went towards Scylla, he would lose a few of his men on the ship. But if he went towards Charybdis, he would lose his entire ship itself. Putin too was confronted with this Ulyssean dilemma, and he decided to take the lesser force, which was Ukraine, rather than confront NATO directly, that was led by the US. And the reason behind that is that this is a 3-decade history that has happened. After the fall of Soviet Union in 1991, NATO had systematically begun inducting all the ex-Soviet republics and satellite states that were there, and their total membership moved from 16 to 30. Now, Putin claims that there was an agreement that NATO would not move on certain countries, but that is a disputed fact. The fact was that in 2008, Georgia, a former Soviet republic, applied for NATO membership. Now, Georgia has a land boundary of something like 500 kilometers with Russia, and Russia felt threatened. So Putin launched a military operation to liberate two regions, South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and made them independent republics. Almost simultaneously, Ukraine applied for membership of NATO too. Now, this was an even bigger worry for Russia because Ukraine had a 2,000 kilometer long border with Russia, apart from a 500 kilometer sea coastline. I asked Bala Venkatesh Verma, India's former ambassador to Russia and a top expert on the subject, as to if Ukraine joined NATO, what was the existential threat that Russia would face? And his answer was that if Ukraine joins NATO, it would be a permanent dagger at Russia's throat. And he went on to say, if Nepal had an alliance with China and China put missiles against India, would India just sit down and watch it? To understand Putin's mind and his way of thinking, we have to go back and look at his phenomenal rise to power. He was a former KGB spy when he was appointed president of Russia in 2000. At that time, Russia was dejected, disunited, and was dismissed as a third world country. To his credit, Putin used the massive oil resources that Russia had to rebuild the economy. He also united and brought order to the 85 provinces, which are called oblasts in Russia. And he modernized the military and made it into a phenomenal fighting machine. In 2014, when Putin found that the pro-Russian president that Ukraine had was pushed out of power, he sensed that Russia's national interest was at stake. So he carried out a bloodless annexation of Crimea, which is a key peninsula on the Black Sea. Crimea is dominated by Russian speakers and was transferred by the Soviet Union to Ukraine in 1954. By annexing Crimea, Putin made his first big move to bring Ukraine to heel. The West imposed sanctions on Russia for the annexation of Crimea, and for a while, the Russian economy suffered. But Putin's personal popularity soared within his country. Almost simultaneously, he made his second big move to contain Ukraine. He orchestrated a rebellion in the two eastern provinces of Ukraine that border Russia. These are Russian-speaking provinces, and the ultimate aim of Russia was to create a land bridge right from that eastern provinces to Crimea. And why was that important? Because the connection between Russia and Crimea is through a 19-kilometer long sea bridge and was always vulnerable. As the rebellions raged in these two provinces, which is the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces in eastern Ukraine, European countries stepped in to broker a peace between Russia and Ukraine. The agreements they reached, called the Minsk I and II agreements in 2014 and 2015 respectively, promised greater autonomy to these two regions, but at the same time ensured that Ukraine's national borders were intact. But the Minsk agreements didn't last long and soon broke down. Then in 2019, there was a major development that happened in Ukraine. The comedian turned politician, Volodymyr Zelensky, became president with a landslide majority. Initially, he said he wanted to broker peace with Russia, but he soon turned hostile. He applied for European Union membership and, worse for Russia, said he wanted Ukraine to join NATO. Then he went one step further. He invited the British to develop a naval base for Ukraine in Odessa, the key port that oversees the Black Sea. That threatened Russia. And meanwhile, America supplied over $2 billion of arms to strengthen the Ukrainian army. Putin said that if US and NATO countries permitted Ukraine to join NATO, he would take decisive action. He also charged them with breaking the Minsk agreements. Of course, US and other countries say this was Putin's game and the war was really to expand Russia's sphere of influence and recreate Soviet Union and the glory days that it had. Whatever be the truth, on February 24th, 2022, Putin invaded Russia and asked his Russian forces, what he called special operation, to liberate the two provinces, Donetsk and Luhansk, and make them into independent republics. He also said he would crush what he called neo-Nazi forces in Ukraine, and that would be the objectives of his invasion. But the war didn't go well for Putin and Russia initially. Plan A was to attack Kiev apart from the eastern regions and take the capital by storm. That didn't happen because both the US and Europe backed the Ukrainian forces fully, and they put up an admirable resistance against the Russian forces. This made Zelensky a hero. Also, by then, the US was winning the propaganda war across the world. Worse for Putin, he never expected Europe to unite the way they did, because after all, countries like Germany and others were highly dependent on Russian oil. But ignoring their own national interest, they all came together to resist the Russian invasion and assist Ukraine. So Putin and Russia went to plan B. They decided to focus all their war effort on the eastern front of Ukraine. Apart from the two provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, Putin's and Russian forces made a major thrust towards Mariupol. And why was that important? Because Mariupol was the only city that was blocking the Russian land bridge that would get them to Crimea. So the fall of Mariupol was in many senses a very, very important development that made them achieve quite a lot of their objectives for going into war with Ukraine. And because it allowed them control of 80% of the Black Sea coastline that Ukraine had and cut off maritime trade fully from Ukraine, further isolating the country. Yet it is not time for either Putin or the Russian army to savor the capture of Mariupol. In the two eastern provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk, fighting continues. The Russians are only in part control of these two provinces. The Ukrainians are putting up a big fight over there. Despite the capture of Mariupol, the Russian Navy is still vulnerable on the Black Sea. Recently, Moskva, a guided missile cruiser, which was the flagship of the Russian Navy's Black Sea fleet, was sunk by Ukrainian forces. This was a major embarrassment for Russia, and they would still have to ensure not only a victory in these two eastern fronts, but also the port of Odessa and other areas. They are keen on ensuring Russian supremacy. So the war will not end soon. Also, Putin is acutely aware that NATO forces, particularly the US, is providing both arms and aid to Ukraine to ensure that they will not succumb to Russia. Meanwhile, NATO countries, led by the US, have opened a whole new front against Russia. They have persuaded Finland and Sweden to apply for NATO membership. This is unprecedented because both these countries had maintained their neutrality right through the Soviet Union period and the fall of it, and kept an equidistance between NATO and the former Warsaw Pact countries. Though membership has still not happened for these two countries, with Turkey and Croatia objecting to their entry, but this is seen merely as bargaining chips for these two countries, and it is very likely that both these countries would be admitted to NATO soon. This would be disastrous for Russia because the fact that Finland shares a 1,200 kilometer border with Russia means that even if it neutralizes Ukraine, NATO has another country where it can mount its missiles to threaten Russia. And with Sweden joining in, the entire Baltic Sea, which is so strategic for Russia's security, will become vulnerable. The other aspect is that with a united Europe and a resurgent America joining into the fray, the proxy war that is currently on, with Ukraine in the middle of it, is likely to continue. Most experts say that this war will not end soon. And that is a dangerous trend. Because right now it is between Ukraine and Russia. But if either European countries or the US, for some reasons, become combatants in this war, they join it directly, this would result in a third world war that would be disastrous for the globe. While the war has largely been confined to Russia, Ukraine, and a few NATO countries, the economic impact of that has had consequences across the world, including India. Apart from the energy shocks, there is a global food shortage that is happening, there is rising inflation, and there is every danger of a global economic collapse. We have already seen two countries in our neighborhood fall because of inflation, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. There is likely to be greater political disruption if the war continues. And why is that? That's because Ukraine and Russia together account for 28% of the wheat exports, apart from 65% of the cooking oil exports, particularly sunflower. Now, this has impacted all countries, including India. You take a look at cooking oil, sunflower oil. India imports a whole lot from Ukraine. But because Ukraine has stopped exporting it, prices have risen not only in India, but across the world. Wheat prices, because of the shortage, has gone up by as much as 60%. and recently went higher when India banned exports to other countries because of the alarming heat wave that happened in the country and the fear that production would fall. So inflation is being felt across the world, and this is going to cause major disruption. The world ahead is not going to be looking good this year because apart from the fact that COVID persists, you will have inflationary forces there, a possible economic recession that will happen, and global turmoil if this continues. To avert a global food crisis and also a global economic collapse, it is very important that the war ends soon. Russia may be more amenable to a settlement, having captured Mariupol and achieved much of the objectives, including a land bridge to Crimea, as well as control of the Black Sea. The West, given the fact that it has imposed enormous sanctions against Russia that will push the Russian economy down and ensure that they will not emerge victorious out of this war, could also work towards some sort of arrangement that will bring the war to end. Experts are not hopeful at all. They believe that the war will continue for a long time, and if it does, it is going to be a nightmarish scenario which will cause enormous misery and political turmoil and disrupt the globe. So it is important that major countries come together, including China and India, to persuade Russia and Ukraine to sit at the negotiating table and work out a settlement. Because the alternative is frightening. Global disruption, global turmoil, global misery. This is something we certainly don't want. Thank you for listening to Nothing But the Truth. Look forward to having you here with me next week.